Hey everyone, I'm Ryan, you're watching 60 Cycle Hum, and in this video, I'm gonna try my best to measure, document, and describe the differences between the classic Fender offset vibrato unit that you find in Jaguars and Jazzmasters and various other guitars that use the system, and the new Panorama vibrato they're putting in the American Professional 2s, the sequel to the American Professional guitars. So anyways, let's talk about kind of the cosmetic differences, the outside differences that you can see. They're functional too, they're not just cosmetic. So on the classic unit, you can see there's 3 big screws here that are kind of round and bulbed on the top. And those have been a problem for a long time because they actually line up directly underneath where the low E and the high E are strung through. And if the action is too low on your offset, the string will actually rub against that screw, potentially causing problems. I haven't had that issue because I keep my bridge a little higher. I tend to shim my necks and things like that. But people who keep a lower bridge have had issues with these. There's different things people do to solve that issue. They'll replace the screws with flat top screws, or they'll flip the screws around so this part will be inside of the mechanism with the flat side of the screw poking out. Not really, a cosmetically attractive way to do it, but people do it. So the difference on the Panorama is they've taken those screws and they've moved them in. Those 2 outside screws have been moved in, so they're in between the low E and the low A, the high E and the B. It makes total sense. It's what should have been done in the first place, and they finally got around to it. Now internally, there are big differences inside versus the classic and the new Panorama. First of all, on the classic vibrato units, you have something called a collet, which is the part that the wiggle stick mounts into. It's a little metal post that's been split into 4 pieces. And if you get one, unluckily, that isn't tight, the arm just kind of swings around. This one is nice and firm, so the arm doesn't swing very easily on its own. And people have wrestled forever trying to get their collet to be just right. Inside of the Panorama, it does something that a lot of the kind of higher end boutique versions of the offset vibrato do. It's got a big metal block with a hex screw in there to tighten down whatever mechanism is holding the bar in place. And this one actually has a little bit of like a nub on it for that mechanism to grab onto versus the smooth bar that you get with a classic vibrato unit. Now, the most compelling difference. This is the important thing that I'm going to sit here and measure and talk about for a while. They've changed the pivot point in the Panorama versus the classic. They've also changed the pivot mechanism. In the classic ones, you have this bent piece of metal here that meets into the bend on the plate, and that is your pivot point for the tremolo action, the vibrato action. Inside of the Panorama, they've completely changed that. There's a hinge now. The hinge, the central bar of it, is connected to where the 3 screws are, and then there's 2 outside mounts connected to the bottom plate, and there's a hinge screw in the middle of this whole mechanism that moves the pivot point from back here forward and in between the 2 plates. So that completely changes the central motion of the whole unit, giving it a different range. It still feels like an offset vibrato, and I'm going to show that as I measure it. Here in the lightly wiggle kind of territory, it's going to feel about the same. You're still going to get that smooth sine wave vibrato action that you know and love from your offset guitars, but you can dive it deeper because that central pivot point has been moved forward and central instead of back and down or up, however you think about it. So let's start measuring. I've got 3 guitars here. The American Professional Jazzmaster, obviously. I have my MIJ Jaguar that happens to have an American Vintage reissue vibrato on it. And I have my super modded Squier Vintage Modified that has a Descendant vibrato, one of these boutique, high-end kind of takes on the Fender vibrato. So I'm going to measure all three, and we'll see how they do. I'm going to be using my Peterson Strobe Stomp tuner here because it is the fastest and most accurate tuner that I own, and it has a huge screen, which is good for the video. All right, we've got our low E in tune. I'm going to measure this in millimeters. I mean, with any ruler, there's a little dead space here, so this isn't going to be a completely accurate measurement, me mentioning the starting point, but I am going to be able to measure how far I move the bar down to achieve a desired result. So first, I'm going to dive down to a D, below the E, to see how far it needs to go. We're starting at 6 millimeters. A little hard to do this. It's right about at 4.5 millimeters, so 1.5 millimeters to get it from E down to D. Now let's see what happens when I push it all the way down. Let's see how far this goes, how low it goes when I dive bomb it. Why do I need the ruler? I don't. F sharp. It almost goes an octave. And pretty close to back in tune, even though I dive bombed it. The Peterson's crazy accurate. It shows every little difference. Now let's do the same with the Jaguar. Now this is a guitar with a different scale, so that might affect it to a certain extent. But let's just, cut the difference here instead of nitpicking too much, right? So this starts off with the tip of the bar at 6.5 millimeters. Right about 4.5 millimeters. So 2 millimeters to get down to that D. All right, let's see what happens when I bomb it. Sharper than A sharp. So functionally, probably B. I can dive bomb it to B musically. All right, the Descendant vibrato. What does it take to get down to D? This is starting lower at just under 6 millimeters. Wow. Actually, really subtle range on this. I had to go all the way down to 3 millimeters. So a 3 millimeter difference between E and D on this. Let's see where it dives to. C. The Descendant is the most subtle of the three. That is interesting. The Descendant, by the way, is a unique design where the plate is dropped down into the vibrato quite a bit so that the strings can actually have a higher break angle off the bridge. solving issues like buzzing and rattling and things like that. It's also adjustable. You can take riser plates out of this to rise the whole system out if you want to. I kind of like having it lower. It is interesting that this is such a subtle vibrato in range compared to the other two. Let's do a little bit of like a fluttery test here. We'll turn off the reverb. I really think all three have pretty much the same feel where it counts, in that kind of fluttery, like initial sort of wiggle stick territory. Obviously, the dive ranges are completely different. You can really dive this thing almost a full octave to F sharp. That is bonkers. Way less dive on the other two, but I think that's a really interesting improvement or change. It might not be an improvement in your book. You might like the more subtle vibrato. You might like the more subtle range, in which case I think that Descendant is the way to go if you want a really smooth, subtle vibrato. 3 millimeters to get from E to D on that, where it was like 1.5 millimeters on the two Fender branded units. I think 2 millimeters on one of them. I'll have to go back and check my notes. I should chart the whole thing out. So anyways, I hope that answered some questions for people. I hope this was a useful resource. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, dislike, leave me rude and nasty comments. Support us on Patreon. Buy a shirt if you want to. You might be naked. You need a shirt. I sell shirts with links down below. And you know what? Stay grounded. Bye, everybody.